Someone you love will die. You already know this. And when it happens, there will be rituals, a funeral, a gathering, flowers, maybe. Words spoken over a body, you will do these things without questioning why. But the urge behind every single one of them is older than language, older than agriculture, older than the will. It reached back at least 300,000 years to a time when your ancestors did something that no animal on Earth had ever done before. They stopped, they looked at the dead, and they chose to do something about it. But the question is, what?
For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed prehistoric burial was a relatively recent invention. The working theory was that symbolic behavior, the kind that buries the dead with care, showed up maybe 40,000 to 50,000 years ago alongside cave paintings and carved figurines. A cognitive revolution, some called it, a sudden leap. Then, in 2015, a team led by paleoanthropologist Lee Berger announced the discovery of Homo naledi, remains deep inside a South African cave system called Rising Star. The bones were not scattered. They were not dragged there by predators. They were deposited deliberately in a chamber accessible only by a narrow shaft 12 centimeters wide, roughly 30 meters underground. Homo naledi had a brain roughly one-third the size of yours, and yet the evidence pointed to intentional placement of the dead. Berger's team proposed this as deliberate mortuary behavior from a species that should not, by our old assumptions, have been capable of it. That finding cracked something open in the field, because if Homo naledi was doing this, then the impulse to treat the dead with care is not a product of big brains or complex language. It may be something far more ancient in the primate lineage, something closer to instinct than ceremony. Your closest living relatives, chimpanzees, do something that researchers spent decades struggling to categorize. In 2011, primatologist James Anderson published observations of chimpanzees at Cameroon's Sanagayong Chimpanzee Rescue Center caring for a dying female named Dorothy. They gathered around her. They held her. When she died, one male sat with her body for an extended period, not eating, not moving away. Anderson's team had documented similar behavior across multiple sites. Chimp mothers in the wild have been observed carrying the bodies of dead infants for days, sometimes weeks, cleaning them, holding them against the chest during sleep. The behavior stops only when decomposition makes it physically impossible to continue. This is not burial, but it is something, a refusal, at some neurological level, to simply move on. Now step forward to 100,000 years ago. At a site called Kafse Cave in modern-day Israel, archaeologists found the graves of at least 15 early Homo sapiens. One grave held a child, approximately 12 years old, buried with the antlers of a fallow deer laid across the body. The antlers were large. Carrying them underground served no practical purpose. Whoever placed them there was making a choice about meaning, about what the dead child deserved to take with them. Christopher Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London has argued that Kafsa represents the clearest early evidence of what he calls a concern for the dead that goes beyond disposal. The people buried there were not just removed from the living space, they were honored. At the same time, in sites across southern Africa, there is evidence of ochre being applied to bodies before burial. Red ochre, iron oxide, ground into powder, found smeared on bones, mixed with grave goods, packed into the soil around skeletal remains. At the Pinnacle Point site in South Africa, ochre use dates back at least 164,000 years. The pigment has no nutritional value. It does not preserve bone. It was applied because it carried significance. Whether that significance was protective, spiritual, or social, the researchers can only infer. But the pigment was intentional. Think about what that means. Someone 164,000 years ago ground red powder, carried it, and spread it on a body. That act required planning. It required a mental model of what the dead person was, what they had been, what they might need. It required, at some level, an understanding that death was not just a physical event, but a threshold. By 28,000 years ago, the evidence becomes dense. At Songhir, archaeologists found 3 burials from that period. 2 of them held children, buried head to head, covered in thousands of ivory beads that had been sewn onto clothing, now long decayed. Each bead had been carved individually from mammoth ivory. Researchers who replicated the process estimated it would take approximately 45 minutes to produce a single bead. The 2 children were buried with over 10,000 beads between them. That is roughly 7,500 hours of labor, nearly 4 years of solid work devoted to clothing the dead. The individuals buried at Songhir also showed signs of physical abnormalities consistent with long-term disability. One of the children had a leg that had been broken and healed in a way that would have severely limited mobility. They had been kept alive, cared for, and then buried with extraordinary investment. Anthropologist Eric Trinkaus, who analyzed the Songhir remains extensively, argued that these burials reflect not just emotion, but organized social obligation. A community that has committed resources to the dead has committed to the idea that its members have worth beyond their productivity. You do this too. Every time you arrange a funeral, every time you spend money on a casket or flowers or a stone marker, you are participating in exactly that logic. The form has changed. The logic has not moved. In the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 4,500 years ago across Europe, death became architectural. The long barrows of England, the passage tombs of Ireland, Newgrange being the most studied, the dolmens scattered across France and the Iberian Peninsula, these were not built for individuals. They were built for generations. At Newgrange in County Meath, constructed around 3,200 BCE, the inner chamber aligns precisely with the winter solstice sunrise, so that for 5 days each year, light travels down the passage and illuminates the bones of the dead inside. Someone designed that. It took decades of labor and an astronomical precision that required systematic observation across years, possibly generations. The dead were not just buried. They were given a place in the calendar, a recurring moment of contact with light. What this tells you is that by the Neolithic, death had become a community infrastructure problem. Where do the dead go? How do the living maintain a relationship with them? How do you mark the transition from one state to another in a way the whole group can witness and share? These are not metaphysical questions. They are social engineering questions. And every culture on Earth has answered them differently while asking the exact same thing. In ancient Egypt, beginning around 3100 BCE, the answer involved preserving the body entirely through mummification and building stone structures that would outlast every living thing around them. In the Toraja highlands of Sulawesi, Indonesia, some communities still keep the mummified bodies of the dead in their homes for months or years before burial, treating them as sleeping, bringing them food, including them in family conversations. In Tibet, sky burials have placed the dead on mountainsides for birds to consume since at least the 12th century. The body returned to the world rather than separated from it. In Varanasi, India, cremation pyres on the banks of the Ganges have burned continuously for over 3,000 years. The method is never the point. The point is always the same. Something must be done. The dead cannot simply be left. Every culture that has ever been documented has had a mortuary practice of some kind. Not most cultures, every culture. That consistency across geography and language and climate and time suggests you are looking at a behavior that is not taught so much as it is carried. Neuroscientists have started to explore what happens in your brain when someone close to you dies. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and social modeling, activates heavily during grief. So does the anterior cingulate cortex, associated with the pain of social separation. Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of Arizona has studied complicated grief using fMRI imaging, and her findings suggest that your brain processes the loss of a deeply bonded person similarly to how it processes physical injury. The attachment system built to keep you close to your group, which is ancient, predating the genus Homo, does not have an off switch. It continues signaling for the presence of someone who will not return. Grief, in this framing, is the attachment system running correctly in impossible circumstances. The rituals that surround death may have evolved partly to give that system somewhere to go, a place for the impulse to do something for the dead. Research by psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University across multiple cultures found that ritual participation following death consistently reduces complicated grief outcomes. The ritual does not eliminate pain, it structures it. It provides a moment in time after which certain behaviors are expected to shift. It allows the living to say, "We did what was required. The dead have what they need." Your ancestors standing over a body 100,000 years ago, placing ochre on skin that had stopped moving, were doing something neurologically coherent. They had an attachment system producing this stress. They had hands that could act. And they had, somewhere in the social group, an agreement about what action meant something. That is where ritual comes from. Not from religion, not from philosophy, but from the collision of grief and the human compulsion to respond. Tonight, when you think about someone you have lost, the pull you feel toward doing something, visiting a grave, looking at a photograph, saying a name out loud, that pull has been in your lineage for at least 300,000 years. The people who placed those bones in the Rising Star Cave felt a version of it. The people who carved 10,000 beads for 2 children in step felt it.
The Neolithic engineers who aimed a stone corridor at the winter solstice felt it. The details change with every generation. The pull never did.